All right, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Building Tomorrow's GRC. We are really excited to be offering this deep dive into the first ever State of Continuous Controls Monitoring Report and to get into the details of what's holding companies back from really modern, future-proof GRC. I'm Gabrielle Hovenden. I am the lead copywriter at RegScale, and I have created a lot of the supplementary materials that we've been releasing around the report over the last 2 months. And today I'm joined by two of our expert solution advisors, Will Jenick and Shannon Williams. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves before we move on to some brief housekeeping notes and dive in. Will?
Yep. Hey, I'm Will. I'm a solution advisor here at RegScale, and I have a background in cybersecurity consulting on the federal space and also the commercial and finance space.
Yeah, and I am Shannon Williams. I'm also a solution advisor with the organization and similar background of cybersecurity consulting, particularly in the state space, financial space, and a couple different other industry sectors.
Wonderful. Thanks, Will and Shannon. And now for just a few brief logistical notes. As you'll notice, attendees automatically have their video and audio off. If you do have a question, we will leave some time at the end, so please just use the Q&A feature to ask our panelists the question. If you'd like to see captions, just click Show Captions in the toolbar. We will also have a brief survey once the webinar has ended. If you do have time to take that, we would appreciate your feedback. And finally, the webinar will be available on demand, and it will be sent to your email shortly after we conclude. Now, the reason we're here. So this webinar is really possible because of the research we've released in our first ever State of Continuous Controls Monitoring Report. If you haven't read that report, it surveys nearly 200 CISOs across sectors. It contains a lot of really interesting insights, and we will have a link to download the full report at the end of the session today. But we really wanted to focus specifically on some of the main barriers and obstacles that were identified in this report that CISOs are saying are really standing in their way of fully future-proof modernized GRC. And they're also obstacles that we've seen ourselves in our practice as we help organize, streamline, and accelerate their GRC. And in addition to that, we do want to explore some of the ways that we can solve and address those obstacles. A few really notable statistics from the report before we dive into the meat and potatoes. We found that only 5% of CISOs really consider their compliance program to be optimized. That's pretty significantly low. We also found that 80% of CISOs admitted to unnecessary duplication in their compliance efforts, which is obviously leading to substantial inefficiencies for their teams. And we also found that 54% of CISOs have not embedded compliance into their CI/CD pipelines, suggesting once again that GRC is just really not being optimized for efficiency on a widespread level yet. So with that in mind, let's dive right into the first key obstacle that we're seeing that is holding businesses back from the kind of efficiency and effectiveness that they're looking for. And the first one is probably familiar to anyone who has actually done GRC as a practitioner. So we began with this one because the question of tools and technology is really a crucial one. So as the report found, a really significant percent of CISOs, 42%, are not using any GRC tools to collect and maintain their evidence. And why is that a problem? First of all, because manual copy-paste workflows are leading to duplicate efforts. Second, because static documentation in your typical office software is really requiring complete annual rebuilds, so more duplicate efforts on a yearly basis. And then without a centralized GRC tool, teams are really wasting so much time managing redundant evidence, doing other manual tasks that it's just causing real backlogs. Shannon and Will, what have you noticed from the organizations you speak with on manual processes?
Yeah, so as mentioned, a lot of our clients come to us with their data either in a Word, a PDF, or an Excel. And what I find when you're working in those types of business tools, they're really powerful business tools, don't get me wrong, But when it comes down to doing this type of activity on a regular basis, I mean, could you imagine being in a Word document and having to scroll to page 200 just to be able to find the specific control that you want to update, right? And in Excel, there's always that room to accidentally click in the wrong cell and delete some progress that you've made. Same thing with Word, just having an accidental mistyping happening within those types of platforms can be pretty common. That can really hinder people's ability to say, okay, where was I last year and where do I need to go this year? It doesn't necessarily make the data as tangible from a updating standpoint as well. And so it just really creates this extra workload of just trying to work within these tools rather than having your data more easily queryable, updatable, searchable, things like that. So the static documentation really creates a lot of that manual process. And when we think about that, it's maybe one Word document that's uploaded onto a SharePoint, and we have various stakeholders that are all working potentially on top of each other inside that Word document, which can cause, sometimes some overwork and stuff like that, which turns out to be an ugly mess. When we think about from an evidence standpoint, that piece is also, sometimes the same exact piece of evidence is needed for multiple controls and then also multiple frameworks. And if you have teams, separate teams that are managing multiple frameworks, they might be asking the same people for the same pieces of data over and over and over again. And then copying that one piece of data into all of the controls where it counts. And so now we're using a lot of multiple stakeholders doing the same exact work and a lot of copy and pasting of this data over and over and over again. So it really isn't efficient from where their current processes are when they come and meet us for the first time. But will any further commentary that you can think of in regards to what you're seeing in the manual processes space?
I think you said it quite well. I think that these manual processes are really the root of inefficiencies and mistakes made in GRC. If you think of cyber overall, threat intelligence, vulnerability management, they've grown in leaps and bounds, but the way in which GRC is tackled really hasn't changed in a long time. Years ago, they were using Excel and Microsoft Word documents and, going around share drive, and we're still doing that today. So especially with GRC, when you have to gather so much data and so much documentation and attention to detail, have your team actually focus on the work at hand and not worry if they are actually in the source of truth or there's a new version of that 20 tab Excel that's out there, right? So I think having that centralized platform is like a single pane of glass is very important.
Yeah. And also I think the next great thing when we think about moving out of our static documentation, it can become a bit cumbersome, especially in that Word document space where you're like, so what's our status? How many controls are we compliant with? How do we look at this from a higher level so that I can report maybe to my leadership or other stakeholders that really care about this information. And when you move it into that data into a more tangible state, then you can more easily create reports and tell that story without having to hand over a 200-page document to your leadership, or at least trying to manually parse down that type of story over time. So I can also see that manual process from a reporting and communication status also being a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for those insights. And that really segues into our next obstacle, which is very much related to this one. And that's a lack of staff resources. So when we saw the research results on this, it was a particularly shocking finding. Nearly half of CISOs, 46%, stated that they don't have the talent to meet upcoming regulatory requirements. That's pretty significant. And that's not to say that they don't have great teams, but those teams are often security teams that are consumed by things like day-to-day incident response and technical operations. So as a result, they're often balancing compliance with their other core security duties. And additionally, the time-intensive nature of compliance work really requires very significant staff resources that many companies just can't invest where they're at. Will and Shannon, how is this lack of staff resources manifesting at the companies you see?
Absolutely. So GRC is really a full-time gig now, 365 days a year. In the past, maybe, as you said, staff were wearing different hats. You had more technical people playing a part in the GRC process. But I think the level of effort that's expected now from regulators and from the mandates that are coming out is only going to be, it's only going to go up and up, right? So you're going to see a lot of companies that are hiring more full-time GRC staff. I think you're always going to have those technical people that have to play a part. For instance, providing evidence or corroborating control. But the benefit of having like a centralized platform for everybody to collaborate in is that they don't necessarily need to learn the full scope of the assessment or the audit. They just need to get access to the platform and maybe do their one task. So that could be, as I said before, uploading evidence or writing implementation statements. So rather than them going into a shared drive and then opening up that massive Excel and maybe entering data in the wrong area, which can cause a lot of delays. This way, by using that platform, it kind of simplifies the experience and enables the staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say on top of that staff enablement from the resources, I mean, I have clients that both have GRC teams dedicated and also just have security teams that are wearing the compliance hat. And I say across the board, everybody is under a lot of pressure in both circumstances, right? And talking to my clients, they're also managing their stakeholders internally, right? Their sales team is saying, hey, we want to move into this market. You guys can just turn around and start adhering to these new sets of regulations, right? And these compliance teams are enabling so much value to the organization by being able to move into those markets, but they're not necessarily getting any sort of additional staff to support all of those maybe potential additional frameworks. And so that I think will also lead to that sentiment of really just not having enough to be able to report across potentially multiple frameworks to meet all of the requirements. So that really also plays into this difficulty to make sure that we have enough people to handle the workload. And then the other thing that I really think about when we're utilizing staff resources, there's a lot of different frameworks out there, and sometimes organizations get thrown a new framework and they have to totally learn something new, and so there's a lot of growth and opportunity in that space for people to become experts in all sorts of ways in regards to compliance, because it's not just frameworks, but it's also how you implement the controls, how you're managing your higher compliance program. I mean, there's a lot of different facets within compliance that is really growing from an expert standpoint. And there's a lot of material right now for people to get into the cybersecurity space, but I'm not necessarily seeing that type of educational drive across industries to be able to provide that education in a similar stance to compliance.
Yeah, that's a really interesting landscape, and I think it's complicated a little by the next barrier. We know that a recent development in pretty much every industry is AI, and in many industries it is really helping with staff shortages and with freeing up resources. But what we found in GRC in our research is that really CISOs haven't necessarily implemented Gen AI yet. A full 82% aren't using AI tools or functions in their compliance programs. And that can be for a variety of reasons, but we are really seeing this significant hesitancy around Gen AI, partly because traditional compliance tools don't have those features, and partly because there is just an overall distrust around using AI tools, specifically in GRC and particularly with sensitive data. Beyond that, we're really finding, the regulations and the standard practices for governing AI usage either are still being developed, are evolving, or just have not been widely adopted by industries yet. So that leaves us with a real opportunity for Gen AI that just hasn't been taken up yet. Will and Shannon, what does that look like in your practice?
Yeah. So, with the multi-tool process, a lot of times it just becomes we have access to Gen AI tools, right? Everybody can access ChatGPT, and any sort of LLM that is publicly available at this point. But those aren't really scoped specifically for the compliance space. So there is not necessarily like a clear direction on how you might utilize those tools. But if you do have some type of creative way, then it also becomes a copy and paste type effort. Once again, we talk about copy and paste efforts and trying to remove them. How do I take any sort of value I gain out of Gen AI to bring it into wherever I'm working from a compliance space? So there's that effort that you'd want to remove. What we found also is that lack of creativity around the Gen AI tools. So within our space, we say, you grab all of the data that you need, but starting sometimes to write your implementation statements. I don't know about you, but for me, starting with a blank slate is a lot harder than starting with some type of content put together. And so what I find AI can be really great at is take your bullet point notes as to what is there for how you want to implement your implementation statement. Put that into Gen AI and say, make a good structured sentence in a couple paragraphs about this, and then utilize that to really get more value into your implementation statements without having to spend a lot of time thinking through like grammar and how do I start a sentence? I think that's always difficult for me. It's just like getting over that first that nervousness of that first blank slate, right? So utilizing AI in smart ways like that, I found has been really cool.
Yeah, I think that overall narrative, right, linking AI and LLMs to GRC hasn't really caught on yet, but it seems kind of counterintuitive because especially GRC is such a documentation writing heavy, pulling data together experience that having LLM, to Shannon's point, can really help you with, your team can focus on pulling that data, writing accurate statements, and then that LLM can look over your shoulder and correct those sentences if there's error or sentence structure. And so our platform uses RegML, and that assists with auditing and also authoring. Our customers use it to write implementation statements. And so far, I think when we've talked to our customers, it's led to an 80% higher accuracy when you're writing those control implementation statements.
Yeah, and you mentioned the auditing piece. That's the other really great place to apply AI is say, take a look at what I've put together. Right? We put a ton of work into setting all of our statuses, writing our implementation statements. Let's use AI to also grade where we are. So like, let's get a cheater before we go through our full audit or pay for some type of an assessment. Where am I at? Use AI to give you recommendations on how to improve your compliance, as well as improve maybe your statements. So we're taking the workload of and making it so that when you do hit those bigger milestones that are a little bit more expensive because we're paying for somebody to do a full assessment, like let those people really earn their value because you've cleaned up your work with AI as well before you hit that status, which I find is really cool.
Get rid of formatting in 2025, right? Shouldn't be wasting time in Excel making sure that the font is correct. Like let the LLM and let all of that happen there, but focus on actually doing the detailed work.
And one thing that we didn't really fully jump upon in the bullet points yet is that distrust and uncertainty. I think that those are really aggressive words, but right now we have not seen an industry vertical say, well, this is what we are going to do with AI. And so I think that leads to independent organizations trying to navigate that space on their own and with their own legal and compliance teams. And that is where, since there isn't necessarily a full everybody, we're going to do this, that leads to organizations being kind of more cautious around engaging with AI tools. And so that's just one thing that I am seeing. And I would encourage, whenever you're using an AI tool, I would always bring your human brain to the process and just make sure that you have that oversight we are suggesting, yeah, have AI write your implementation statements, but please use your human brains to read over and be that extra check as well too. So one recommendation I can have when you're utilizing AI.
Absolutely. Machines can't fully replace us yet.
That is true.
And AI is obviously so promising and so complex. I think all of us at RegScale are really excited to see both AI capabilities and AI adoption evolve over the coming months and years. It's really accelerating quickly. The last key obstacle that we identified to really modern future-proof GRC was a little bit of a surprising one. It might not be surprising if you're at one of these organizations or you are experiencing some resistance, but we were really really interested in how much of the barrier to GRC, just cultural resistance to change, can be. If you look at this little wheel, we have some really obvious resistances to upgrading your GRC. Financial concerns are a significant percent, almost a third. Certainly technological concerns, miscellaneous concerns, but over half of CISO said really the main resistance was just a cultural obstacle. And when we dive into why that is, we are creatures of habit. People are used to the legacy processes they have in place, even if those aren't the most efficient. So that does create some really understandable hesitation around change. But another reason is that the initial time investments for everything from platform migration to training on a new tool can really create hesitation. It is real. It's not going to be an overnight switch. We also find that the short-term effort required for the proper system setup, for data labeling, for all those steps can sometimes overshadow the long-term gains of future automation, of a really strong automation platform. Shannon and Will, what does that look like in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So that level of effort, right, up front, I think is a really good indicator of resistance that we see. It's never a good time in compliance, right? It's always a busy season. You're either prepping for assessment or actually doing assessment or conducting an audit. So you have your manual process in place, but you have this tool, and now you need to train up on that tool. So you are actually doing your work in the manual process and then training this new tool at the same time. So I think that is an area where there's some hesitancy. I think also, as you hit it correctly, the monetary aspect. You're not just investing in a tool for 1 year. If you are going to use this as a source of truth, you need to consider the costs in the year to come, because year over year, you are going to be investing in this tool and training your team up and putting your data into it. And that's where your compliance artifacts are going to live. I think also just, looking at that long term versus short term. In the short term, all of what I said is true. Maybe a higher cost, maybe more of a busier season with your team training on a new tool. But long term, I think using that platform is going to allow your team to efficiently do their process and not have to, deal with the same issues that they're dealing with now. So it's really a now versus a later type decision that you have to make.
Yeah, I like to use just like a comparison and, what a user might say, I know my process, I've been doing it for the last 5 years. It takes me 3 months to get all of this in order, right? And when we're moving into a new platform or a new process, it then may take the 3 months plus some extra time to, overcome that educational barrier and also move that data into the platform. So we're taking something that it's going to take 3 months to a questionable extra amount of time, right? How quickly can your organization adapt and learn? And so that, I think, leads to some initial hesitation. Whereas when we think about that process for the next year, we've taken that 3 month time. You've already, learned and trained, so you don't have that extra unsubjective time. That 3 month time might become more of a 1 month process. And so there is going to be that initial investment of time to add in on top of your typical window of time to complete a task, to learn and change and adapt. But you might see some longer term year-over-year time that you save because you're working in a more efficient way. And so I encourage people that are being asked to change their processes or adapt over time, give yourself the grace that there is going to be some time, and ask for that time in your project scheduling and with your management team. Look to try to come to some common ground to an understanding that this might take a little bit longer this year, but you're going to see the return on your investments long term, over time. So that's my recommendation there from an organizational, overcoming that cultural hesitation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Taking that long view is pretty essential when you're trying to get buy-in for a change like that. So we've looked at four really key barriers today: lack of staff resources, manual processes, AI hesitation, and now organizational resistance. Now we want to look at continuous controls monitoring, a solution to these barriers that we've seen help organizations really overcome all of these obstacles and improve their GRC programs significantly.
Mhm.
So I'll begin just with a brief definition for anyone who isn't familiar. Continuous controls monitoring, or CCM, is a sophisticated GRC approach that really helps businesses automatically monitor their security controls and their compliance processes in real time. And what that allows for is constant oversight of internal controls, but it also enables companies to immediately detect and respond to policy violations, to operational efficiencies, to all sorts of other issues, giving you that real insight and visibility into what's going on. And Will and Shannon, who are working with CCM every day, can dive in a little deeper and kind of get into some of the core benefits of what we've seen CCM bringing organizations.
Mhm. Yeah, so when we think about CCM, we're trying to take the mentality of, I develop a Word document once a year and do all of this effort on collecting this data, and that stays stagnant for a year until I have to do it again the next, or maybe your window is a 3-year period. Whereas if we put that data in a more tangible location, you can more in a more agile way go in and adapt. Something's changed in my system. Oh, that it does impact this statement. Let me go in and just make an adaptation, so that I'm continuously updating my data in real time. So that when I need to produce that report, it just becomes a, click here, click export for this type of document type activity, right? We're not spending a entire fire drill of an experience trying to put together the report when the auditors come to our door, right? So this is something that I find to be very valuable, as well as, when our stakeholders come, what's our status? Once again, you have that data being in a very tangible place from a reporting standpoint, so you can make those stories and communicate to your stakeholders as needed at any point in time. So that near time real insights is really valuable. When we think about cutting that manual processing, I think we've hit upon that several times around this copy paste effort, but we can also find efficiency in that evidence collection. So, imagine you have, one piece of evidence might be your acceptable use policy, right? That comes from potentially HR. And if we're managing multiple frameworks and that's related to multiple controls, that becomes, maybe 3 people are reaching out to the HR director being like, where's the AUP for 2025? That person is then taking that and sending it over to maybe 3 different stakeholders on the compliance team, if you have 3 different frameworks that you're reporting to. Well, what if we made that more efficient? What if we said just one person reach out to the HR director, teach them how to upload that when it is new and fresh, and then have the platform take and map that to wherever it is needed in the platform. So as a control owner, that piece of evidence is just always up to date. we extrapolate and recommend from there out, hey, take all your evidence collection and spread it out for the entire year so that you're focusing in and saying, well, let's handle the HR documents in January, but let's handle the financial documents in June, and then in October, let's look at the process documents with our tech team, right? And so you're taking, once again, that fire drill, oh, everybody get me that new documentation. We can spread those activities throughout the entire year and be more precise. And then also make sure that they have the capabilities to upload their evidence themselves, which is also helpful. That's also really great from finding efficiency. Then that third bullet, single pane of glass into GRC. I mean, imagine having 3 different frameworks and then trying to describe to your stakeholders, what that adds up to. Well, if we take data and we smartly map it together, then we can tell a much better story and say, well, across these frameworks, this is where we are, communicating in a very efficient way to say our compliance status, we're good. Right. This is where we're at across all 3. And this is where those 3 kind of, intersect as well too. So those are my thoughts there.
Yeah, that dashboard is very key, right? To everything you said before, getting all that data in, and you want a real-time view, but actually having that interface and looking at the current status, whether it's, evidence items that are outstanding or control implementations that still need to be written. That's a really, really good aspect of having a platform. I also think in regard to data silos, right? Companies have data in a lot of different areas, and it's currently manually imported into maybe a spreadsheet. So let's say you have your vulnerability scanner, you have your SIM tool, a GRC platform such as RegScale really plug into those integrations, right? So you can have it all in one location. So your Nessus or Tenable scanner can go into the platform. You can see access logs. You can see everything you want in one place, and not have to go and log into different systems to get that and document it in a separate place. So in real time, it's aggregating those files into one location. I think also to that last point, right? Kind of what we said before. You really should be spending your time on the actual granular work of writing and documenting and pulling data, and not having to be worrying about version control and going into different shared drives. So one platform that everybody has access to, their use case is defined. They can't necessarily go into another person's use case and mess around with that, but everything is defined in one location.
Yeah, and I think all of these benefits are why when we did our survey, we found that so many CISOs really see continuous controls monitoring as something that will improve both their compliance and their security, which was just pretty heartening. We found that a pretty significant 94% really felt like CCM was a key to solving their problems, which is, maybe a little easier said than done when it comes to implementing. So I am going to tee up Shannon and Will, who are really our in-house experts at implementing CCM, to walk everyone through some just tips and best practices for implementing that continuous controls monitoring solution, and just broader mindset in your team.
Absolutely. So this is the fun part, right? This is where Shannon and I come in as solution advisors and help the customer out. I think right out of the gate, there's a lot of requirements gathering, right? So we want to understand the key data based on your use case. What is that data? Where does that data reside? And how are we going to actually bring that into the tool? We also love to hear your current processes as they are now, right? So any documentation around incident response or conducting assessments that you have, send to us and we review that. And that helps us better understand how your process currently will be mapped out into the platform. It also helps us understand and tweak the trainings that we'll have for your team members down the line. We also like to pay attention to what we call first values of what success looks like early out in the gate. So that could be having your team provision to the tool, or having that first implementation statement written. These are things that we like to talk to the customer about. but really it's just diving in deep with the customer and defining their process in the tool, right? We help them. We don't let them do it themselves. Like, we are there every step of the way.
Mhm. Yeah, and I will say also when we talk about that first value, prioritization I think is really key, and being realistic for your internal organization. How fast do projects move, as well as how many resources can we dedicate to the project, so that we're really scoping this down to a realistic bite. What we want to see from a first value is that aha moment where you are already doing probably a full process in our platform, is what we would want a first value to really be scoped around, to say, yes, we are immediately seeing some gains based off of this project work that we've done. And making sure, from a moving that process, there is some data migration, and that's why we exit. Well, that's why we have jobs, right? So as solution advisors, it's our job to help you smartly think about moving that data and then assist you in moving that data into the platform. So we will be taking off some of that work and that lift and shift by engaging with a solution advisor to get you guys up and running the platform. And then, I would say just expectation setting. There is going to be that initial big lift and shift into the environment. And for a lot of our clients, it does feel like going through the entire audit process. But the reason why is that we want to make sure that we've got good data going into the platform. So for some of our clients, they're like, well, if you don't feel like your data is really all that new or accurate to where you are, it might make sense for us to start from scratch and use the platform processes to build out your entire program in the platform if you want to, because we have the AI tools to really help us along and get us to where we're going. So you have known good data in the platform. And then additionally, migrating your processes and data, if it lives in a Word document, it might not be as easy for us to be able to pick that up and move it. But we'll work together at identifying what is that key data, as well as said before, to move it into the platform. So we always know when we do that full handover, we are moving all of our processes in the platform. We feel really confident in what we're working with from a data and a process standpoint.
Yeah, it's a lot of work up front, but again, now versus later, long term, once you're up and running the tool, the process runs pretty seamlessly. So
Mhm.
Absolutely. So Shannon and Will, any other tips or best practices, or should we move into our Q&A?
Come with a positive attitude. We're excited to work with you. So I hope that you're excited to work with us when you come over. We try to make it really fun. And I love providing training. I always say to my clients, like, let's make you guys the experts in the platform too. And so I love providing that training and getting you guys excited about working with us. So
we also love hearing input from our customers as well.
yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have some really good questions in the chat coming, and we've also had a couple questions DM'd as well. And I think I want to start with one of those because I think it's a nice transition into the questions. So the question is, what's coming next? By which I mean, what are the upcoming challenges in GRC that you're trying to solve for?
Oh, what are the next problems? I think the inevitable is, I'm being asked to do more with less, right? And that for me is, how do we make our clients very efficient at what they're doing? So I would say finding efficiencies and processes, being able to leverage data smartly, create things once, so that create a structure once so that your process moves smoothly through it multiple times. So I think a great example there is that evidence mapping, being able to say this one piece of evidence translates to all of these controls. You start that mapping once, and then that activity after that just becomes, okay, grab that one document, upload it to the record, and then that is automatically pushed out to all of the controls that it matters from an evidence standpoint. Right. So it's a great way where we can find efficiencies, because our our clients are being asked, continuously to do more with less and less, and it's always so difficult. So, being able to be efficient is going to be really key there, I think, from a next frontier.
Yeah, to piggyback on that statement, bandwidth is going to be what next is, right? So those manual processes are going to be untenable, especially when companies and competitors are using the platform, and yeah, they're moving at a quicker pace. And as I said earlier on this call, I think that the level of effort required for regulators and responses is only going to go up.
Mhm. And we're also seeing more and more organizations look to think, how can we communicate back and forth with our regulators more efficiently? So I think the other frontier that we might see is like more effectively communicating back and forth with our regulators. And I think putting your compliance information in a tangible data format is going to really lend itself to that. So, a great example, the frontier of OSCAL with FedRAMP, and FedRAMP being able to accept data in OSCAL format. Um, I think that's where we might see some other organizations move in that direction.
Yeah, fantastic. Please keep the questions coming in the Q&A. We've already got a couple, and I am going to just read the next one. So my understanding of the product points to the involvement of company-wide stakeholders, depending on the control to be monitored. How do you approach getting that buy-in from the get-go with the various parties across the organization? It's a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, specifically in the platform, keeping those controls updated, we like to have owners. So, on the company side, you're still going to have team structure of responsibility of who's responsible for that specific control. But within the platform, you're assigned to that actual control. So, depending on when it needs to be updated, you will receive a notification, depending on that frequency that you define within the tool.
Mm-hmm.
So, it keeps
Yeah.
you.
I think the other thing is that getting that buy-in is difficult. So being able to communicate, and what I love is, if we can any sort of way quantify how long things take and how difficult and repetitive some activities are from the beginning, and then we can then communicate where we would be from a new process standpoint. Well, we are finding that you get hit up 3 times to be able to update this on this amount of, just come here and update it once. You'll find efficiencies there. So being able to identify those wins, to communicate those to our stakeholders to get buy-in is going to be important. And then additionally, I think that the training piece and just hesitancy in learning something new. Humans have an initial urge to nervousness around change, right? And that's natural, and so natural for us to be hesitant around it. But really, I would say, talking about the support that they will receive from a training standpoint is going to be really big, and just saying, no worries, we understand that this is new to you. We will have the training and documentation available to make sure that you feel comfortable as you move forward in this new process, so that they do feel better about making that change, for sure.
I think we
Yeah.
do. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Will.
Think depending on the customer, right? Everybody learns differently. So I know Shannon, you were on site recently with a client. We'll do trainings virtually. We'll write out documentations and send it over via email. But whatever is the best way for that customer to learn, we definitely work with them through that.
Mhm.
Yeah, those are some fantastic tips. And I think we have a good follow-up to that question, which is how might you get buy-in specifically around the integration piece? So getting the data into the system, getting it loaded in, because I'm imagining that's a somewhat onerous part of the process. Do you have any strategies for that part?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of integrations available for our clients. And what I like to see in an integration is where, like, say, our vulnerability management team works in their vulnerability management tool. How can we efficiently get the data from them and send it over to us? And the way that our scanner integrations work is they would set up like a data space within, say, their Tenable or their Qualys, and say, this is where I want RegScale to pull this scan data from here. we would then set the integration up to say, okay, I want to grab this from this location that vulnerability manager has set aside for me to grab from. I grab that and I bring that into the platform smartly. What's wonderful about that in our scanner integrations is you can set it in a couple various different ways to say, well, I want to not only grab all the findings from that scan, I want them to create issues for everything that hits for a high or critical or a medium high critical. And it will also populate your assets within the platform so you can start monitoring your assets too. So it can automatically create a lot of data on your side. And then from like a poem, like a FedRAMP reporting poem standpoint, it will also do some automatic reporting based off of that too for you, which is really great. We have the ability to set certain issues to poems. And so that will help you with your poem documentation as well. So I would say with our integrations, finding out how we can keep those stakeholders within their tool where they're comfortable, and then not having to have them do some type of export, upload it into the SharePoint type activity where they can just set things up on their side and then we just pull automatically from there. That's always great.
And I think also getting that buy-in, right? That's part of the requirements gathering sessions that Shannon and I do early on in the process, right? But that stakeholder would attend that meeting and we talk about the data that's most important to integrate, and then exactly what within that data they want to be brought into the tool and how it's represented. So having that discussion in like an open forum with other team members really helps that process along and getting agreement and buy-in, and then actually, clicking the button to bring it into the platform.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And we have one final question. I think it's a really good foundational one, and it is a multi-part question, so we'll maybe tackle part of it at a time. The question is, I'm having a hard time really understanding what a control is, what the need and value of having controls are, how they're monitored, and how they can help manage compliance across multiple frameworks. So maybe let's just start with the first part. What is a control and what is the need or value of those controls?
Yeah, so we're using reg scale language. It might be a requirement. So think about an entire framework, NIST 853, AC1. That is what we are calling a control. In PCI DSS, it's like a requirement. So there's the 12 major families, and then there's sub items underneath those. And so you might have requirement 1.1.1 for PCI DSS. So what is the requirement coming from the regulator in a very specific context? We put those into controls to then be able to say, when you're reporting back, I am specifically saying for this requirement that you are putting upon my organization, this is how I am compliant. And so that is where that need is from a control standpoint, is being able to communicate back to your regulator specifically for the requirements being put upon your organization.
Yeah, to piggyback on that as well. So depending on the requirement, right? NIST is one, and you mentioned PCI, but that framework is brought into our platform. And once those controls are in our platform, we would write implementation statements to meet them. So let's say there's a mandate to your point, meet that access control. You must have an access policy that you update annually, right? You have that statement, and then within the platform, you would write how your team meets that objective. And that's tracked, right? So if that control changed next year with the update of the framework, your team is aware and they would update their documentation, right? So those controls and those statements are kind of in flux, right? They're constantly being updated. They're a live document. They're a security plan within the platform. But that's what we mean by controls.
Mm-hmm. And then that piece of monitoring, let's take a requirement. Say your regulator says you must have a password policy, and they don't have any sort of other things. I'm going to keep it super generic. You need a password policy, right? Alluding to what Will would say in that control, you would say, well, our password policy is it must be 12 characters. It must rotate on this amount. If you do rotation, it must have this complexity, right? You might be specific in your implementation statement. And then from a monitoring standpoint, you would then potentially, if you have like a full audit, the auditor might say, well, show me these systems and how they meet what you have from how you've implemented it. And so then you're going into system X, being able to show them, yes, this system is set to make sure that it meets our password requirements. And if there's any sort of limitations there, say there's a system that doesn't allow you to customize your password complexity or something like that, being able to clearly state, well, we recognize the system, this is an exception, this is how we manage that exception. Our employees still have to follow our password policy, even if the system doesn't fully require all of those different fields. So being able to talk back and forth with your auditor, and that's when we say monitoring, being able to go in and check on those systems, and reach out to those system owners and say, hey, this is what our policy says. How are you making sure that that actually is happening in an implementation at our organization? Because it's one thing to unfortunately, we are seeing organizations decide, well, I can just have AI write my policies and procedures to check a box. But if AI is just writing all of those for you, they might not actually be implemented in that exact way in your organization. And so that's where that monitoring and checking really come into play, because that's compliance. We've written our policies. We know that our policies match our procedures and how we run things in our organization. And we have the evidence to support that and answer that question whenever somebody comes at our door saying, how do you do that?
Yes, one-stop shop, right? And that evidence is uploaded right there. And you can view that right next to the implementation statement. So control, I see what the requirement is. I see how my team is meeting it or my company. And then I corroborate that by clicking on the attachment in the same window and seeing that screenshot of that password configuration or password policy to prove that it's actually in place.
Mm-hmm. And then when we think multiple frameworks, that last piece to your question, Danny, I think it's a fantastic question. How do I manage this across multiple frameworks? Right? We would be looking at finding efficiencies at mapping from, one framework to the next framework. We have that capability within our evidence, being able to say, well, this one piece of evidence goes to every single one of these frameworks across. So you can find some efficiencies when you're saying to your stakeholders between multiple frameworks in the evidence piece, as well as your implementation statement piece, being able to take that data and just efficiently use it. If you have to say, all of a sudden somebody says, well, now we need to comply with this new thing because we just moved into this market. And you're like, okay, how do I adapt? How do I take my data and move it smartly into this next framework? So thinking about that is definitely, it's also a new frontier too, on being able to efficiently report across multiple frameworks. So
that's wonderful. It's some really valuable definitional information that I think is helpful for anyone who's grappling with multiple frameworks or even grappling with just a single framework. Mm-hmm. I think that's all we have for questions now. So I do want to just make sure that I thank both Shannon and Will for their expertise. We really appreciate it. And thank all the attendees for their time. We're really grateful that you could join us, and we hope you found it valuable. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can use the QR code that's linked here on the screen. You can reach out to us via our website. We are always happy to chat, to answer more questions, just connect. Please stay tuned. We're going to continue to have resources from the State of CCM report released. Lots of good event appearances coming up and lots of exciting news on the horizon. So thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you guys.